Welcome to the Dublin History Festival and our session on lost property, exploring a number of important Irish Research Council supported projects that are taking place in Ireland. We have an excellent panel of researchers who will discuss a range of ways in which architecture and archives, digital reconstructions, and public commemorations help us connect with Ireland's intangible past. We're recording the session today, but not the Q&A at the end. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute for the Humanities and Social Studies at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and I'm a board member of the Irish Research Council, and I will be serving as chair of today's event. Before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Dr. Felicity Maxwell of the Irish Research Council for coming up with the idea for this session and for making it happen as part of the Dublin History Festival. Felicity is working behind the scenes, in fact, as host of the session on Zoom. We will be looking at 4 different projects over the next hour. The first in our sequence is Craftvalue. Craftvalue is an Irish Research Council advanced laureate project at the Department of the History of Art and Architecture, Trinity College, Dublin. It provides a new skills-based perspective on the architecture of Britain and Ireland from 1680 to 1780. PI on the project is Professor Christine Casey, and she is a professor of architectural history at Trinity College, Dublin. She's an authority on Irish and European architecture and craftsmanship of the 18th century. Christine is going to be joined by 2 people working on the project, Dr. Melanie Hayes and Dr. Andrew Tierney. Melanie Hayes is a postdoctoral research fellow. She's an architectural historian, and she specializes in Ireland's 18th century architectural and social history. Andrew is a research fellow at Trinity College, Dublin, with a broad interest in Irish architectural history. He's the author of Central Leinster, published by Yale in 2019, a recent volume in the series of Irish Pilsner series. So Christine, over to you to kick us off for our panel discussion today.
Thank you, Dan. Well, welcome everyone to Craftvalue, which is an IRC research project based in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture in Trinity College. High quality craftsmanship is a defining feature of 18th century architecture. The buildings which you see behind me here in Trinity College were constructed from the finest materials by the most skilled craftsmen of the period. And yet our histories have tended to treat craft as background noise, placing emphasis on other things, such as those who designed the buildings and those who paid for them, despite the fact that they wouldn't exist without what the Greeks called the doers, who quarried, cut, carved, and assembled the materials, raw blocks of stone, rough blocks of timber to create these wonderful buildings. So Craftvalue aims to bring to the fore the many skills involved, the multiple actors who created the buildings of the past. So we want to document these skills and to articulate what is essentially embodied knowledge, and a knowledge which underpins the Georgian architecture of Britain and Ireland. So history, of course, involves rethinking the past as well as documenting the past. In one sense, our project responds to the decline in craft skills which accompanied mechanisation and which governments all over the world at the moment are seeking to reverse by investing in craft apprenticeships. So on the one level, we are researching historic buildings, but at another, we are exploring living cultural heritage. So a dynamic and enlightening route to the craftsmanship of the past, a hotline to the craftsmanship of the past, if you like, is found in conservation. Lost property prompts evaluation. In the words of that Joni Mitchell song, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And behind me here, you see the wonderful Clandon Park, a National Trust property. We're working with Clandon Park at the moment. Here you see it before the devastating fire of 2015. And here is that same space after that devastating fire. And yet, despite the losses incurred, the fragmentary remains, which you see here, constitute an X-ray or even an MRI of the craft processes of the past. And so we are looking at the skills needed to conserve these buildings. Here you see a master plasterer working at Longford Cathedral after the devastating fire there. And this man actually, master plasterer, travelled from Lincoln to Longford weekly to work on this project. And if you're in Longford Cathedral, that boss on the ceiling, you might think it's all moulded. It's made actually of 40 different pieces. So when you look at the buildings of the past, what we're trying to get you to do is to consider the skills. So Leinster House, a building which you see all the time, spare a thought for those who actually created and conserved these buildings. The familiar facade, which you see behind me here, it's always on the news bulletins, is the work of many hands. And if you look at the image behind me, the limestone columns are not, as you might expect, single shafts of stone, but are assembled from more than 10 sections, while the pale grey stone, which you see, reflects the problems faced by conservation architects and craftsmen in trying to match the original profiles. And so what I want you to do is, as a result of our work on Craftvalue and thinking about what Melanie and Andrew will show you now, is to think about the actual masons, the carpenters, the carvers who worked on these buildings. And as part of our work, a digital output of the Craftvalue project has been a recreation of the lost House of Commons in the former Dublin Parliament House, now the Bank of Ireland, on College Green. And this has been carried out by Andrew Tierney and Melanie Hayes, and they will now discuss their work on that.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Dan. Good afternoon. My name is Melanie Hayes. I'm just going to share my screen with you. I'd like to talk very briefly about the subject of our short film, Recrafting Parliament, and think a little bit about some of the challenges we faced, the processes which we employed in our research, and the questions and answers which these threw up. And the first question, I suppose, is why did we choose this subject? What's significant about this work? Well, the former Parliament House, which, as Christine mentioned, is now the Bank of Ireland at College Green, is a hugely significant building, not only in Irish terms, but from an international perspective. It was built from 1728 to the designs of Edward Lovett Pearce, a brilliant young architect of limited experience but unbounded vision. And as the first large-scale Palladian public building in the British Isles and the world's first bicameral Parliament House, purpose-built Parliament House, this design was pioneering in its forms, in its function, and in the sophistication of its craftsmanship. It really put Dublin on the architectural map. Yet, although the outer fabric of this building survives mainly intact, much of the original interiors, as Christine has mentioned, have been lost or altered. Detailed building records have disappeared if they ever existed, and visual sources are thin on the ground. Well, the craftspeople and the processes involved in its construction have been largely pushed to the margins of history. Our aim, therefore, was to piece together a fuller picture of the building history, using a hybrid process which drew on a range of documentary and visual sources, some of which we can see here, from paintings, architectural drawings, to manuscripts, newspapers, and parliamentary reports. Our aim, or what we sought to do, was to digitally recreate a sense of what has been lost. The building itself is a really key source of information, and close examination of this surviving fabric really tells us a lot. It prompts us to consider some of the craft techniques employed. Take, for example, the giant Portland stone columns shown here in the forecourt. Just as Christine mentioned at Leinster House, 22 columns in total, and each one is divided into 7 short and long sections of Portland stone. Looking at these, we wanted to know how these particular structural features were made and why in this manner. Is it a matter of style, cost, skill, or maybe just the practicalities of transporting the material? Other aspects of the exterior, such as the windows, have been altered, or in this case, removed and blocked up. And this presented us with a different challenge. Precise visual records of the originals do not survive, so we had to look to other contemporary examples, such as I'm showing you here at Mount Ivors in County Clare, to establish a source for the original glazing pattern, which has been recreated by my colleague Andrew Tierney here. So thinking about the building fabric, we can get a lot from this source, but what about the written records? Now, I've mentioned the detailed building accounts are lost, but some records of construction do survive. In particular, the Journal of the Irish House of Commons provides a really, really valuable resource, and it tells us much about the financial impact or undertaking in this building. Labour was a major expense, and the masonry trade, unsurprisingly, given the quantity of stone used here, accounted for much of the costs. But structural carpentry and joinery expenses were also considerable. This resource also tells us about the identity of some of the individuals involved, the master craftsmen, journeymen, building suppliers involved. And we could see that alongside established local artisans like the mason Nathaniel Winnery, master plasterer William Spencer, or the carver John Houghton, who executed these really beautiful Scamozzi and Ionic capitals in the colonnade. Edward Lovett Pearce also brought in some new men who seemingly came from England to work at the Parliament House. William Borrowdale, for example, who was one of the principal stonecutters involved here, seems to have had connections to Whitehaven in Cumbria. In the records, we learn that on Christmas Eve, 1729, Borrowdale was paid almost £750 for stonecutters' work carried out that year. Now, this is a huge sum of money. It was equivalent to the annual salary of 22 highly skilled craftsmen. And this perhaps indicates that Borrowdale was in charge of a much larger workforce. These were certainly collective enterprises involving really large numbers of craftsmen, varying trades and varying skill levels. And we get a real sense of this in the records. These journals also give us details of the specific materials employed, on occasion where they're sourced from, and how much the individual elements cost, as well as the Portland stone, which we've already encountered, and the granite used in the walling in the forecourt. We also learn of blackstone, which is a local calc limestone quarried in Palmerstown in County Dublin, and it was used on the sides and the rear of the building. So lots and lots of detail, say, about the material and the material finishes at the Parliament House, specifically inside. I'm sorry, I'm just getting a bit of feedback there. We learn about the material finishes inside, not only of the Irish oak and the gilded stucco work in that former House of Lords, but about large quantities of thick red paragon cloth used in the door curtains here, of yards of gold and of crimson lace that were used to finish the trim of the seating in the House of Lords, or of green baize, brass nails that were needed for the door into the House of Commons. And these snippets of evidence, however fragmentary, when we join them together, we can really bring the reimagined space back to life. But I'll pass over to my colleague Andrew Tierney to discuss that in more detail. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to very briefly give you an update on where we are with the model since we worked on the film during the summer. It's worth stressing, firstly, that the purpose of building a model like this is twofold, really. Firstly, something that can be taken apart, and for our purposes on Craftvalue, we're looking for ways to show how buildings like this were fabricated. A means to really educate ourselves and others on the way the whole thing was put together. And we also want to convey, as I think Melanie has just done very well, a sense of the labour and the skill that went into making them. The key point here is that elite architecture is not the historical legacy of the social elite, or indeed the political elite, but it's a legacy of a much broader demographic of workers, from stone cutters, masons, carpenters, joiners, whose expertise and skill was essential to the execution of buildings like this. Secondly, we hope to be able to present the model in a more engaging fashion than traditional media allows. So ultimately, by the end of our project in 2023, we'd like to be able to display this on a virtual reality platform whereby people will be able to re-experience what it's like to actually walk through the spaces of the Parliament House in its original form, and to get a sense of the scale of the building, which is something very hard to communicate in video or still images or indeed in writing, that sense of how one's own body relates to the scale of the building. The process of recreating the building also allows us to interrogate and reflect on some of the surviving sources in new ways. For example, we can better consider the way the dome was constructed at two quite separate scales, an interior scale and an exterior scale. The extraordinary superstructure of the roof of the dome, which you can see here in various different guises, was recorded in a survey in its final form by James Gandon in the 1780s, and it shows just how high the structural carpentry had to go to create the dome in its final form. And the reason for this seems to be to do with the building's plan. If you look at a cross-section of the Parliament building as a whole, you can see exactly how far back the House of Commons was from the front of the building. And clearly, Edward Lovat Pearce, the architect, from the start had envisaged having to go quite high with a superstructure over the dome so that it would be visible from the street. But in fact, even with the height that it ultimately went, and of course, Pearce was dead by the time the final decision probably would have been made on this, you can see what it looks like in a straightforward orthogonal view from the front, and this is the way it would have appeared on Pearce's presentational drawings to his clients. But in fact, when you add perspective and depth, the dome sinks away into the background. So there's a huge amount of work on the part of carpenters to try and get that dome up to a height, and ultimately not being able to actually make it work in practice. And this is something that late 18th century architects such as Gandon and his contemporaries were quite critical of. And you'll notice that in Gandon's own buildings, like the forecourts and the Customs House, the domes are right at the front of the buildings so that you can see them when you're walking by. So lessons were learnt from the way in which buildings like this at the early part of the 18th century were actually constructed. We also have the opportunity to consider with the model some of the spaces for which we have no direct visual or written records, such as the Court of Requests, which was effectively the main entrance hall into the building, which was swept away after the Act of Union. And we've been able to put this back together based on some drawings by Pearce, or one surviving drawing, which kind of indicates the general scale of the room. And we have a written record from the 1780s, published in the Freeman's Journal, which describes the fact that there was a rusticated finish on the walls, which you can see here in the model. The roof, the ceiling, which is a cove ceiling, is based on surviving cove ceilings elsewhere in some of the smaller rooms, some of the surviving smaller rooms in the building. Finally, just to give you a brief look at the interior of the House of Commons itself, and to show you some of the details we've been able to reconstruct, such as the doorway through which the speaker would have come, which is based on that in the House of Lords, for which we've got good evidence, and the niches up in the gallery, which are also based on those in the House of Lords, but which we know were also produced in the House of Commons as well. So I'll just give you a few bits and pieces that we have included in the model in the last few weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. In fact, that's a very exciting project. I mean, the images alone are extremely compelling, but I think it also invites us to think about how we can experience history through architecture. And there are probably plenty of people wandering around through central Dublin who don't realize that this is once a parliamentary building. So we're now going to move ahead in our discussion and move on to our second speaker, talking about the project Beyond 2022, Ireland's virtual record treasury. Our speaker is Dr. Ciarán Wallace, and Ciarán is Deputy Director of Beyond 2022. He's also Secretary to the Irish Historical Society and a convener of the Dublin History Research Network. The project Beyond 2022 grew from an Irish Research Council New Horizons collaborative project, which was led by Dr. Peter Crooks at Trinity College Dublin. It then became a Decade of Centenary's Legacy Initiative, which is now supported by the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht under Project Ireland 2040. Ciarán, can you talk to us about this wonderful project?
I surely can. Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the opportunity to share our work with you. I'll just share my screen with people here and hope all can see it. So there we go. So first of all, my name is Ciarán Wallace, delighted to be here. I'm the Deputy Director of Beyond 2022. As Dan was saying, our project started by Professor Peter Crooks of Trinity College Dublin and the late Shay Lawless, who brought the idea to the Irish Research Council, and the Research Council funded us in our infancy. So like any good parent, they trusted us to blossom, and they held our hands through some those difficult teenage years, as any researcher will tell you, as a research project gets off the ground. So the idea that we had, to explain the idea, we need to kind of go back a little. So let me just take you back in time and give you the history of where the project comes from. So for centuries, Irish archives, the state archives, all the state papers that you need to hold to run a government, were really badly managed. They were scattered in unsuitable buildings, subject to damp and vermin, accidental fire and theft, and were really kept in very bad conditions. Then in 1867, this building you see here, the Public Record Office of Ireland, was opened. Now, this was a modern, purpose-built premises, very cutting edge at its time, state-of-the-art, safely located inside the Four Courts complex, beside Church Street and the Bridewell Garda station. So it's kind of where the Lewis line runs behind the Four Courts. That was the back of the Public Record Office. The building that you see had two blocks in it. So there's a front block, then the small square block, which is the administration building. And this is where the archival staff worked and where the public came to research. Now, this was seen as the risky building. This is where there were gas lamps for reading, open fireplaces to heat the working spaces, and pipe smoking scholars, and it presented a huge risk to the actual vulnerable records. There have been many archival fires in Ireland before in different locations, so they really wanted to protect these records. The building behind with the tall arched windows that you see, that was the record treasury. I sometimes think the front building looks like a bank in a provincial town, and that word of bank and treasury, it's about security and safety. So the treasury at the back with the tall arched windows, this was where the records were actually stored. It was a 5-story building above a stone vaulted basement. Inside there were metal walkways, metal stairways. They used fire-resistant timber, everything to reduce the amount of risk of fire from the front building. There were no gas lamps or fires allowed in here. And you'll also see, highlighted on the photograph, there's a sort of a fire gap, a fire break between the two buildings. That wall that you see in the gap between the two buildings is just a screen wall. Behind it is a void. So the two buildings just basically kiss at the ground floor, which is a set of double doors and a little covered walkway. And the whole idea was to protect the back building from the front building. So the building opens. Over the years, state records relating to all areas of Irish life flooded into the building. Land ownership, taxation, court cases, law and order, the census, agricultural records, schooling records, the full range of state and public life across 7 centuries fill the shelves. Any older repositories that have medieval records put their records into this one new central purpose-built location. During its 55 years career, the PROI published transcripts and summaries of important collections that it held, and its staff made detailed catalogues and indexes of the contents. These works made the records searchable by scholars and civil servants who were doing research on various parts of administration or on historical projects. It was a busy, productive and successful institution. In 1916, the forecourts and the Public Record Office itself survived occupation by the volunteers, but 1922 was a different matter. Anti-treaty forces occupied the complex from April to the end of June, at which stage pro-treaty National Army forces shelled the building. The anti-treaty occupiers had used the record treasury as a munitions block where detonators and explosives were stored in amongst the records, and then shelling began. So the result was quite different. As you'll see here, on the 30th of June 1922, in the heat of the battle, a tremendous explosion and fire engulfed the entire repository, throwing the contents, centuries of contents, up into the air, incinerating them instantly and blowing the ashes out across the city, out as far as Howth Head, in fact. 7 centuries of archives were destroyed in this one afternoon. So this event created a huge hole in the Irish historical record, and understandably the idea took hold that everything was lost in 22. And this is something I grew up with, something I studied with as an undergrad. However, that idea is not entirely true, and that's where we come in. So beyond 2022, based on its original Irish Research Council funding, is now a state-funded research project involving historians, archivists and computer scientists. We're hunting down copies and transcripts all around the world of Irish records held by other libraries and archives, and there are many, very many. We found these during the early phase funded by the IRC. In an era before photocopiers or scanners, officials made handwritten duplicates of correspondence the day they wrote the original, and scribes often afterwards made careful transcripts of important files. These are replacements for the originals lost in 1922, so they could have been just copies, but when the original is lost, the copies become really valuable. In addition, most of the catalogues and summaries and indexes I mentioned that were created by the PROI staff over the years, they were stored in the front building, and the front building actually survived the worst of the damage. Additionally, miraculously, there are a few rare original documents that were actually in the stone basement under the building and in a strong room in the front building that survived. So these are now the salved record collections. So we're working on having those sort of replenished and replaced to join our research. So what sort of things are we finding? Just to roll forward here. So the Irish Record Commissioners, this is another IRC, a completely different IRC from the Research Council. The Irish Record Commissioners, they were a group of scholars employed by the state from 1810 to 1830 to create like a backup, a handwritten backup of the most important historical records in Ireland. So this is before there was ever a record office. They transcribed large tranches of material, and the idea was to publish this material and put it out in the world, say multiple copies. They created large volumes of neat copperplate handwriting and transcripts of documents going back to the reign of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and the Stuarts. Many of these were never actually published. By the time 1830 came around, they still were only in handwritten form. They hadn't reached the printer, and the whole operation was shut down. Those transcript copies got scattered around the world, and now we're turning up volumes in, for instance, the Huntington Library in California. We're finding volumes in Trinity College Library in Dublin, the Royal Irish Academy, Maynooth University Library, and this extensive early 19th century transcript is producing over 350 volumes and millions of words previously unavailable online. So the, excuse me, the idea of what we're going to do with these, well, in addition to finding, for instance, the transcripts from the record commissioners, we've also found transcripts of much earlier copies. So, for example, the Harris manuscripts, this is in the National Library of Ireland. The scribe who wrote this wrote it in the 1740s. He had in front of him a document from 1291. The 1291 document went into the record office for safety, was destroyed in 1922, but this 1740s transcript survived in the Royal Dublin Society, ended up in the National Library of Ireland manuscript room, and now we can take a digital copy of it and reunite it with the other digital images that we're sourcing. In addition to this, we have all sorts of, like the variety is actually really quite great. We have, so royal appointments, the coloured document you see in the top left corner. This is a royal appointment for the Viscount Clandeboy, held by the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. Perhaps a duller original listed would have been in the forecourts in 1922, and this fully illustrated copy went to the Viscount himself. That's the only remaining version of the document. On the right, you see one of those burnt survivors. So this is a medieval scroll wrapped around a wooden dowel. So it actually rolls in a rolled office. So this is a roll of records. Those sorts of documents can only be interpreted by special experimental X-ray scanning machines. So the National Archives are looking at getting some of those scanned. We read it without having to unroll it because it'd be too brittle. At the bottom of the screen, you see some really beautifully clear medieval tax records for Ireland, exchequer records for Ireland. What could be more boring than exchequer records? As it turns out, these are fascinating. These are the copies so the Irish Exchequer produced the taxation records and sent a copy over to head office in London right across the medieval period. And about 3,000 of these have survived in the National Archives in Kew. And our project is now imaging them, transcribing them, translating them, and bring them into the project. So what do we do with these when we have all these done, all these images fall back together? Beyond 2022 is digitally reuniting as many of these as we can, along with catalogue entries into a purpose-built database. We're creating a virtual reality model of the PROI buildings, both the damaged front portion and the destroyed record treasury. And the aim is to virtually reunite, as far as possible, all existing replacement documents into this 3D environment. And we know from original 19th century listings where every record was shelved within the building. To make a document searchable online, especially a handwritten document, requires expensive and time-consuming transcription by a skilled expert. Since 2016, a completely separate EU-funded project called Transcribus has developed a program to automatically read handwritten documents and transcribe it into digital content. So instead of combing through hundreds of pages of manuscript, you can now search instantly for the person or place name that you want. This also means that those millions of words I described earlier can become digital data. So in addition to building a searchable virtual reality environment, the computer scientists in our project are creating a knowledge base for Irish history, which is a sophisticated tool which will allow cross-searching of all records. This will allow you to spot connections and patterns linking people and places over many centuries in a way you could never have done had you been really in the actual living archive itself before the fire had happened. So what will the result of all this be? The State Archives in Dublin, Belfast and London are all core partners in our work, along with the Irish Manuscripts Commission and Trinity College Library. Almost 40 other libraries and archives in Ireland, Britain and North America are collaborating in the task. And the Department of Culture and Heritage and the Gaeltacht are funding us at the moment to carry the work through to the centenary of the destruction on the 30th of June 2022. It will be a free public resource aimed at all levels of users, local historians, school pupils, genealogists and academic historians. You can go onto our website to see some samples of the documents that we're finding and to try out our prototype VR model, which was just launched on Thursday. And you can go in and have a wander around within the building, look at some of the blogs and the longer articles on some of the people, papers and programming that are combining to restore this great cultural catastrophe from Ireland's history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ciarán. This is such a wonderful project and a national asset, as you say. It's also a great illustration of how something can grow and be recognized and developed, create international partnerships, national partnerships. So a really compelling project for many, many reasons. So, right, we're now going to move ahead in our discussions, and we're going to look now at a project called Festspace. Festspace, we have two speakers associated with it. First of all, Dr. Bernadette Quinn, who is a senior lecturer in the College of Arts and Tourism at Technological University of Dublin, TU Dublin, and she's the Irish lead on Festspace. Festspace has funding from Humanities and the European Research Area, HERA, and it investigates festivals, public space, and cultural inclusion. We also have Dr. Theresa Ryan, who lectures in the College of Arts and Tourism at TU Dublin and works as a senior researcher in Festspace, and she has particular interest in commemorative events. So Bernadette, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. I'm hoping that Theresa will be able to share our screen there. Lovely. Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the IRC for having us this afternoon. So we're from TU Dublin, as Dan says, and we are involved in a HERA-funded project, which is looking at festivals, public space and cultural inclusion. On our first slide there, you'll see we've listed our website, so you're very welcome to go and have a look and see what we're doing. We're working with 4 other universities across Europe. And what we're doing is we're studying a range of events, festivals and exhibitions, all staged in public space, either indoor or outdoor, across the 5 cities. All of the project teams have got project partners in their respective cities. And here in Dublin, we're very pleased to have the support of Dublin City Libraries and also the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. So as you are all probably very much aware, there's a long tradition of hosting festivals and events in urban public spaces over time. And in recent years, the number of events staged in European cities has grown hugely, such that now festivals and cultural events have become a really important form of cultural consumption. So our Festspace project focuses on trying to understand a little bit more about the role that festivals and events play in opening up the public cities in towns, the public spaces in towns and cities to people, or indeed trying to investigate whether they in fact have the opposite effect, which might be to close off or to restrict access to public spaces. So we're interested in understanding the extent to which events foster social inclusion, bring people together, encourage social interactions and exchanges between people from different kinds of backgrounds, from different cultural, ethnic, socioeconomic, socio-demographic backgrounds. But one of the strands of our larger work involves investigating commemorative events staged in public space, and that's what we're going to talk to you a little bit about this afternoon. So societies everywhere organise commemorative events, public commemorations in the public domain to remember significant happenings in the past and to reflect and to rethink their contemporary relevance. So we've heard a little about buildings today earlier, but our interest is in the intangible. Our interest is in the experiences related to what might appear to be ephemeral or transitory cultural phenomena. Events often don't last very long, we think. But actually, once we begin to look at them a little more deeply, the intangibility or apparent ephemerality of commemorative events, it doesn't really hold true when you look deeply at them. And in fact, they're very important in a commemorative context, because once you start looking at them, you realize that they're very significant in creating frameworks for learning, for example. They're very important for arousing interest in ourselves and in the world around us. They play a role in animating, in bringing to life moments and happenings from the past. And they very much encourage us to reflect on and rethink the past, and to use those reflections to make sense of contemporary happenings. And we've seen a little bit of discussion of that recently, not only in terms of historical conflict in the case of the emergence of our own state, but also around pandemics, for example, a very pertinent topic, and more generally politics of all descriptions. Partly because events are short-lived, and partly because of the way they are constructed and represented, commemorative events can have quite a spectacular dimension in that they can capture the public imagination, in that they shine a light on happenings from the past in a very immediate way, in a highly visible and attractive and arresting way. They are, of course, highly constructed entities. And by that I mean, issues of who gets remembered, who does the remembering, and in what light are people and places and happenings remembered. They make commemorative events potentially very contested, possibly even controversial. But ultimately, commemorative events play a very important role in allowing people to have a stake, in giving them an opportunity to develop and deepen understandings, to think about how they fit in relation to the past. And it allows them, to take positions on often difficult issues. So this point of involvement is really important for our project, because while the conversation about remembering the past often focuses on who gets remembered and whose history is allowed to be forgotten, we are actually very interested to understand more about who is engaging with and encountering commemoration through events. So as we remember the emergence of the Irish state these days and weeks and months through our Decade of Centenaries programme, we are interested to know, well, who are these events intended to interest? And who are they actually managing to reach out to? Who are they managing to speak to? Who's hearing them? What about the people who've come to live in Ireland in recent decades, for example? Are they hearing these events? Are they engaging with these events? What kinds of messages are being given out, and how are they being received by different people? These are very important questions for us because they speak to us about the inclusiveness of these events. As I move on to the second slide, another important issue for us is that the events that we study are all located in public spaces. We are geographers. Our project researchers most of us are geographers. So we're interested in the role of public space, both indoor and outdoor. A central question for us is whether commemorative events have a role to play in opening up public space, making it more accessible for diverse cohorts across society. So the image that you see here is of Dublin City Library on Pier Street. It's quite an imposing building and one of the many public spaces in the city that people might not be quite familiar with. Not everybody might be quite familiar with that building. So one of the questions we ask is, do events and exhibitions entice people to cross over the threshold of public buildings like this? Do commemorative events encourage people to visit places associated with memories from the past? Do they bring people to places that they're not familiar with normally? Do they help people feel more at home, more connected, have a better sense of belonging to the places that they find themselves living in, or even that they find themselves passing through as temporary residents or as visitors? So to tell you a little bit more about our empirical work, I'm going to hand you over now to my colleague, Dr. Theresa Ryan.
Thank you, Bernadette. I just have to stop sharing the screen for just a moment there while I unmute myself and start my video. So I'm just take us back onto that, and I'll talk a little bit more about the research that we've undertaken today or to date. And what I really want to do is just give you a sense of some of our research, and I'm going to focus primarily on the Goodbye Dublin, the commemorative exhibition that was held in Pier Street Library as part of the Dublin Festival of History last year. And this exhibition was really all about showcasing, I suppose, and commemorating Dublin's central role in the War of Independence, using photographs, ephemera, film, and also guided tours. And what we've seen is that the staging of commemorative events has become more of the focus of public libraries. So we were really interested in looking at how these commemorative events may or may not make these library spaces more or less inclusive. And key questions that we were really interested in answering was, who was visiting the exhibition and why were they visiting? And what meaning did the exhibition hold for them in terms of their personal identity, their collective identities, but also in terms of their relationship with the library and with the city more broadly. So the findings quickly began to indicate that a lot of the people that were attending the exhibition did not frequent libraries. In fact, a lot of them never went to libraries, or maybe hadn't done so many years. Quite a number of them had never been inside this building, had never been to this library. And so for these visitors, the exhibition really gave them a reason to visit. It helped them to engage or to re-engage with the library space. It also made them rethink maybe long-held ideas and notions that they had about libraries. And they spoke about how the exhibition made them realize that libraries weren't just about books, that these were spaces that offered them lots of different ways of engaging. It made them realize that, they could feel comfortable, that they could become more familiar. So the exhibition allowed them to become more familiar and more comfortable and generally happy using the library. For others, the library building was of interest. This, as Bernadette has said, is a really imposing and a very grand building. And a lot of them were quite intrigued with the building. They passed it on their commutes, you know, but they'd never actually visited. And so the exhibition simply gave them an opportunity to do so. So in these contexts, the exhibition was really instrumental in making the library accessible to these visitors, a space where they were comfortable and where they felt included. So in general, we also saw that the exhibition had the effect of developing visitors' understanding of the city. We saw that for non-Dublin residents, it helped them understand the city, maybe get a little bit closer to the city. For those who had personal connections to the War of Independence, the exhibition helped to reinforce their identity, but also their understanding that the evolution of their family was intrinsically bound up with that of the city. For some, it resulted in feelings of pride. For others, there was quite mixed emotions. But unanimously, people felt that the exhibition was very, very significant and had great meaning for them in terms of their individual identities, but also in answering questions as who are we as individuals and also as a nation. But what we quickly began to realize during the research was just how quiet the exhibition actually was. We visited on numerous occasions over the weeks that it ran. There was very, very few people in attendance. And those that were in attendance were not very diverse. So this really brought us back to our key questions about these commemorative events in terms of their inclusiveness. And, you know, in terms of questioning who are these commemorative events for and what role do they play in making our public spaces more inclusive. So these are questions that we hoped to, sorry, I skipped a slide there. This was just a quote from one of our attendees at the exhibition there. And this is quite a nice photograph showing the final days of the War of Independence in Dublin. And, you know, this quote really illustrates the person, you know, the exhibition causing to think about who are we as a nation and how can we understand where we are as a nation are going unless we know where we came from. So the key question of these events and in terms of their inclusiveness and, you know, who are they meant for was something that we are carrying on in our research, but we also wanted to explore further in researching events as part of the decade of centenaries. But unfortunately, COVID had other ideas about this. We have continued our research, and you see there's a link on this slide to a small video that we made. And this video really thinks about the importance of commemorative events. And so we looked at COVID events and its impact on commemoration. And what we saw was how important commemoration is in our lives. And that the loss of the many commemorative events, some of them were downscaled, some of them were cancelled, but the disappointment and the loss that was felt by many communities because of that. This loss was not just in terms of collective or individual remembering, but it was also in terms of community enhancement, knowledge sharing, and capacity building. So the extensive impact that these commemorative events can have on us is beyond the individual and can have so many profound impacts on us. The video also highlights the profound human response that we have to unite in solidarity in times of adversity. We saw that many commemorative events that were staged during COVID took time out to remember those who had died as a result of COVID and also to express gratitude to frontline workers. So we continue with our research and these key questions of commemorative events and their impact on public space in terms of social inclusiveness. And we're going to look at many, you know, different types of commemorative events. So for example, the forthcoming commemoration of the Bloody Sunday atrocities. So the iconic Croke Park Stadium will be hosting a range of different events to commemorate Bloody Sunday. And it's something that we're interested in looking at. We'll also be looking at other commemorative events. This is just one example of those that we'll be looking at. So that really, I hope, gives you a sense of the type of thing that we've been looking at as part of our research. And I'm going to pass you back to Daniel now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernadette and Theresa, for taking us through that project. We've been looking then at the present day, but also in this retrospective moment as we build relationships and construct identity through these public spaces. So thank you. Our final speaker in the session is going to talk to us about a project which is a collaboration really between University College Dublin and the National Library of Ireland. Maeve Casserly. Maeve is a Fulbright Creative Ireland Museum Scholar working on visitor engagement with historical commemorations in national cultural institutions. And her PhD is funded by the Irish Research Council under the employment-based scheme. As I say, she's based in UCD in the School of History and Archives and also at the National Library of Ireland. And she's working on exhibitions, learning, and the programming department there. So, Maeve, if I can turn to you. Have we got Maeve? Oh, any contact with Maeve there? Okay, Felicity, if you can.
Yeah, it looks like Maeve must have had some technical difficulties and dropped off the call, I'm afraid.
Make sure it wasn't at my end rather than at Maeve's. I'm sorry about that. We may be able to get Maeve to rejoin us. If she can, that would be wonderful. If not, we can, I think, move maybe the participants thus far, if you could rejoin us in the, oh, I see Maeve is.
Here we go.
Maeve. Maeve is there. Are you back with us?
I'm here. Just as I was due to speak, my internet died. So
okay.
Well,
you're back with us. So
my apologies.
Fire away. I've given you an introduction, so people are ready to hear about your project in collaboration with the
Wonderful.
National Library.
Thank you very much, Dan. So thanks everybody. I've had a couple of different technical issues today. My name is Maeve Casserly. I work in the National Library of Ireland, and I'm doing an IRC-funded employment-based PhD in the School of History and also in the National Library, based on my work as a public historian in the Exhibitions, Learning and Programming Department of the National Library. So I have a short presentation, which I'll hopefully fly through to speak to you a little bit about my research. So as I mentioned, my IRC-funded employment-based PhD is about the National Library, but also other national cultural institutions and how they have been curating and creating commemorative events like exhibitions or public programs, and how they use that to engage with the public. And the way that my research works is that I'm trying to combine academic research on history and commemoration, both like commemorative projects and publications, with new trends in museum studies, in the way that museums or galleries or libraries are curating exhibitions, and how museum studies is influencing how national cultural institutions operate. So one of the reasons I've chosen national cultural institutions, I think it complements the Festspace project, which was just on a second ago, is because national cultural institutions, or NCIs, have a very specific national remit. So for example, the National Library's remit is to collect, preserve and make available the memory of Ireland to everybody. And I think that's a real reflection of where we're going now in terms of what we as a public want from our NCIs. So just a brief background, I worked as a public historian with DCC for 3 years on the Great Historian Resident project, which is still ongoing, which had some feedback into that Goodbye Dublin exhibition. I got a Fulbright fellowship last year, which was a collaboration, a really interesting one, with Creative Ireland as a specific museums fellowship. And I went, sadly, very briefly at the beginning of the year, to the Harry Ransom Centre, which is a literary archive and a historical record office in Austin, Texas, to investigate how they do commemorative practices. And it was cut short because of the global pandemic, but I still find it very useful and very informative as to how that cultural organisation did commemoration, and how the politics of Texas and American politics and everything around that impacted on how they engage people with commemoration. And the end goal of my research will hopefully be to produce a sort of a best practice handbook for creative practitioners like myself, people working in museums and galleries and libraries whose job it is to interpret history and present this interpretation to their visitors, and to set out an ideal guideline or template for the best way to interpret history for commemorative events. And this is, as I said, combining up-to-date academic historical research with new trends in museum studies. So to speak very briefly on commemoration, because I know this is already touched on in depth with Bernadette and Theresa, but for me, as was previously mentioned, like commemoration is a form of remembrance of, say, a person, a place, or event from the past, but it is very key, the word reflection, that it is the reflection of the politics, the social norms, and the beliefs of the times in which it is created. So as I said, and as was mentioned, it's a reflection of our own viewpoints and our interests, as much as it is of the actual history that we're remembering and commemorating. So even though all history involves a certain kind of telling a story, whether this is leaving things in or taking some things out to make a particular argument, commemoration is even more complex in this, as it is often tied into complex, often sometimes contentious contemporary political issues, such as, for example, what we're going through in the decade centenaries around the formation of the Irish nation state. So one, I suppose, well-known, somewhat contentious commemorative event was the 1966 Jubilee Commemorations of the Easter Rising. Some of the photographs you see here, the present Damon de Valera. As this was written about afterwards, a lot of scholars and those who are investigating commemorative practice would have described this as an overtly militaristic form of commemoration. And it is one which today we are maybe both less familiar with and potentially less comfortable with in a style of remembering our past and the way that we want to present that to people in modern life. So the Jubilee commemorations are one element, but what I'm really looking at is some decade of centenaries commemorative events. So I'm looking at the Easter Rising commemorations, the outbreak and the end of the First World War centenary commemorative events, the Somme commemorations as well in 2016, and then now as we enter into the end of the First World War, we're into the War of Independence and this idea of nation building. But again, I'm looking at a specific remit around NCIs, National Cultural Institutions, and what they have done as part of their remit to present commemoration to their public and their audiences. So one close to my heart, World War Ireland at the National Library of Ireland ran from 2014 to 2019, and this was telling the story of Irish people's experience of the First World War. And there's a theme that runs through a lot of these case studies that I'll mention, in that they look at the story of individuals, and often individuals who are not well known in history, not the key faces or names that you would know, for example, like Patrick Pearse or James Connolly, but more ordinary people's lives and how we can tell the story of the past through their documents, through their stories as well. As well as this, the very interesting exhibition called Making History, which was at the Ulster Museum in collaboration with a group called Creative Centenaries, opened in 2016. Really interesting exhibition, again focusing on how individuals' lives were impacted on by these wide events like the First World War and the Somme, the Easter Rising, and in particular looking at not only the political impact, but the social, the cultural, and the impact on industry that a lot of these events had, and how this impacted on people's lives as they went about their daily lives. A very interesting one from Wales, and the reason I'm including institutions outside of Ireland, I think it's important to include the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and how those two different locations for NCIs are presenting history, but also to include a more international outlook. And I thought of including the National Libraries and Museums of Wales and Scotland in this thesis, because it would offer an interesting comparative look. They have a similar national remit in terms of maybe their population size, but a very different political circumstance. And this would really help me understand how contemporary politics influences how commemoration is presented in NCIs and the kinds of stories that are put forward in those as well. So Wales Remembered was a really interesting collaborative, collective commemorative project, which was run under the umbrella of the Welsh Government, but it brought together many different museums across Wales to make a very diverse and interesting commemorative programme for 2014 up to 2018 on how Wales remembered its participation in the First World War and the impact of the war on the Welsh people as well. Another interesting one, where there was two very good exhibitions in the National Library of Scotland. One was called Behind the Lines, a kind of a play on looking at people's letters from the front and then behind the lines of the behind the front as well. And then A Better World. These were both staged in the National Library of Wales in the last couple of years. And A Better World looked at what Scotland was facing after the end of the First World War and how its nation would pick up the pieces from there as well. So these are all very interesting and diverse kinds of commemorative events. And what I really found from doing this investigation, and what I'm going to be putting into my research and hopefully into this handbook, which I hope to produce, is that there's this huge focus on the kind of a phrase called ordinary people in extraordinary times. So all of these exhibitions in one way or another used letters, diaries, photographs of what we suppose we call ordinary people, but just people like ourselves. But they really had this focus on creating historical empathy between the visitor and the exhibition or the commemorative event as well. And this was a really key thing in terms of the style of visitor engagement and how contemporary museum studies practice, which is really influential on this, was kind of feeding into that as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I'm finished, and I think we'll move to the Q&A now.
Thank you very much, Maeve. Yes, indeed. If everybody could sort of rejoin us with our cameras on, we'll have a little bit of time. We're running long as it is, but we'll take a little bit of time for some interaction between the panel as a whole. So yeah, thank you very much. That's a fascinating session, and certainly an indication of how dynamic history is in historical reconstruction and commemoration in different contexts. So very much an appropriate session to be having as part of the Dublin History Festival. We have a couple of questions that have come in that I wanted to take quickly, and then we might move on to a couple of other things if we have time. The first question is, and I think I'd like to direct this to Bernadette or Theresa, I think in the first instance, would there be any views from the panelists on the imminent disappearance of the exhibition space in the Pierce Street Library? So I don't know whether Bernadette or Theresa, is that something you're familiar with? Do you have a comment on that?
So that person there is asking whether we're concerned about the the disappearance of the space in Pierce Street. Yeah, now I don't know too much about that. I mean, I think if it's to vanish with no repurposing and no alternative, then I think that's definitely a loss. I mean, I think, as Theresa explained, I mean, I do think that exhibitions are really important in opening up libraries. They bring different people, different kinds of people in, so they broaden their access. They create a different purpose. They they express a different purpose in society through their exhibitions. So I'm not up to speed of what the new plans are to replace that space. I hope there are some plans to replace that space, because I think it would be a loss. I mean, I think going forward, libraries are in a moment of transition, huge transition. They're under pressure a lot of times because of the problems with public financing and resourcing. And of course, we're in this moment of austerity at the moment, which doesn't augur well for public financing going forward. So I would be worried on that front. But I think that there's some examples around the world of libraries where their reinvention in city spaces are moving them very centrally into the lively urban fabric of urban social life. So I hope we don't lose that here.
Yeah, no, I think that is one of the features of and I think Maeve's talk was also indicating just how exciting those relationships can be. I think there's been a lot of reconceptualization of the purpose and public value of these institutions, and the more we can bring more people into them and build clearly the better. I have a question for you that's come in. I direct you, if I may. And this is, would the panel like to comment on the way that planned commemorations can give rise to original research in the period leading up to them? And this person, Paula Dover, is saying, I was particularly impressed by the reenactment of the Battle of Clontarf in 2014, which led to a huge stimulus to research in the decade that ran up to it. So I just wondered maybe if you would comment on, you're obviously somebody who's engaged directly in PhD research, so maybe you're the obvious person to ask. But do you see this as a way of creating new knowledge and new research through this kind of engagement with these institutions and commemoration specifically?
Yes, so I was thinking that this is very much it's a sort of like a chicken and egg scenario, because it's hard to know whether the commemorative events could have taken place without the release of more archival documents. So for example, around the decade of centenaries, very important projects around the 1901, 1911 census, the Bureau of Military History Archives, the Pensions Archives, all of these things are being released. And I think there is a mutual benefit for commemorative events taking place, which are heightening people's awareness around the events themselves, but at the same time there's more open access to a huge amount of material from the past, from these events themselves, where people can now themselves be enabled to go and to do research themselves independently, when it maybe before seemed like it was more closed off and it would be more of something that would be more around the academic spheres. So I think both of those things taking place at the same time have come together in kind of like a perfect storm, where people can become more engaged in doing commemorative research themselves and then participating in it as well.
That's obviously one of the exciting things about the Beyond 2022 project, is partly the invitation that Ciarán was explaining to conduct research, but also at school level for people who are doing genealogical research. A whole host is going to be enabled. Is that something, have you programmed that in some way? Have you built it into the project?
So built into the project is that, and just echoing what Maeve is saying, but the public appetite for history is more than just a commemoration, as in you could do a commemoration, could be just a statue when you walk past it every day, but it's an action, it's a verb sort of thing, I think, and that's the thing that comes across in the research connected commemorative activities. Like our project is, I mean, in theory, our project could have happened anytime the technology was there to do it, but it's happening around a centenary because that's when the public and political appetite is there to fund it. So I'm just being honest about that. But then the public appetite goes into it, sort of driving what we will create will be made accessible for, let's say, you know, Leaving Cert students doing their school project, or for local historians. And the more it gets used, the more it lives. So there's a kind of, it's the chicken and egg that Maeve was talking about, I think, precisely. And if you can catch the public's attention and then feed the appetite that is definitely there, that's what ensures success, I think, in these projects. It's a challenge, but that's what we're aiming to do. But we're building in sort of education packs, those sort of things into the project.
Well, it's so interesting because obviously the commemorations become more difficult. Time goes on. Not that 2016 was totally straightforward by any stretch.
Well, just echo on that, to briefly take another moment on that. I mean, we are recreating something that was lost in the Civil War, at the start of the Civil War. We are not taking any view on who caused, who pressed what button, who pulled what trigger. But we'll happily take part in the conference on it, but it's not our job. Ours is reconstruction. And being honest, that helped us with the politicians and the civil servants. They saw that as a safe way to do commemoration.
That's good. We have a question for Melanie, if I could ask you. Melanie, there's a question came in from Grace O'Sullivan, and she asked, she said, Melanie mentioned some of the windows in the Parliament building being blocked up. I was wondering, is it known when this happened and how much care was taken with this and the material used to match the existing fabric of the building? So I don't know if Melanie or others involved in the project could comment on that.
Certainly, I can, and Andrew Tierney too was heavily involved in the research into this particular aspect. So Andrew, you might also want to feed in here. The precise answer is we don't know. Most likely after the premises were purchased by the Bank of Ireland and altered internally at the beginning of the 19th century, around 1804, and there were concerns expressed at this time about the security of the building, particularly at its front, its forecourt at College Green. the visual record and the written records seem to contradict each other somewhat in this regard. Some of the few surviving views of the exterior of the building, some of them I showed you earlier on in the talk. Some of them show a few of the windows open, others show different windows blocked up earlier in the 18th century. So it is, it's somewhat difficult to decipher, and that was one of the problems that we really encountered with this work and with 18th century architectural history in general. It's the matching up the physical surviving fabrics, images of those works, and then the documentary record. And it is often contradictory in terms of the care taken with the finish. It is quite seamless. It's quite difficult when you examine the fabric to differentiate between the openings in the facade that were always blocked up, even when it was originally built in the late 1720s, and then the alterations later on. It's the interior wall, it's made of granite, local Wicklow granite, so there would have been access to the same quarries, both in the 18th century and later.
And then presumably some of the work that Andrew, you're doing with reconstructions and with those almost animations that you're doing, it makes it possible then to have different modalities, different periods of time in which the building was in use. Is that part of how you're doing in almost a timeline fashion?
Yeah, absolutely. All of those options are available when you're doing a model. For example, the windows that we showed today in the model we're trying to get back to the 1730s, but the windows we know were replaced in the late 18th century, you know, as part of the process of updating the building anyway. And a lot of the views actually show those later windows rather than the early ones. In fact, I think there was only one view where we could see the number of panes in the windows. It was 16 over 16, which we haven't quite fit into the model yet, but we're going to get that as accurate as we can. But there's lots of little subtle changes throughout the building's history, and the model really gives you the opportunity to kind of explore these different realizations of the building. For example, the Court of Requests that I showed you towards the end there, the main entrance hall, we have a drawing by Edward Lovell Pierce of that with Corinthian columns. You know, that was never built, but we could model it and show what it would be like to have gone into the room with that kind of finish. So there's lots of different alternatives. Like every building project has several buildings in it. Some of them that were executed, some of them that were never executed, some of them that are a result of alteration, you know, so it's a building like that's a very complex creature, you know, and we can, I think, reflect some of that in the model.
Well, I mean, I was thinking during your collective talk, I mean, there's so many people walking by every day, going by on the bus, going by on the Lewis, and it's really made this wonderful building available and accessible to people. Now, am I right that you can visit the House of Lords chamber? Is that still open to the public?
Well, possibly pre-COVID, I think on a Wednesday afternoon, maybe between 1 and 2, you'd have to check that. But it is available to the public at some point, or at least has been.
Well worth a visit, an amazing space.
Yeah. And Christine, are you hoping that the project will bring people into the building as well, both virtually but also literally in some sense? Do you think that there's further possibilities there? You're on mute, Christine. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we really want to do is to excite people about the crafted surfaces of buildings. So the digital has that effect. It makes people want to see the original. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Theresa, I have a question that I might direct to you that's come in. It's really for all the panelists, but it's all, and it's the question about how do public events such as historic commemorations, they've been going online, and Christine was and Melanie were referring to the fact that, yeah, under conditions of COVID, various things that we could have done, we can't do now. So the question is, with public events going more online due to COVID, what do you think is lost and what is gained with increasing use of online media for such purposes? I hope it's fair to direct that to you because you have such an inclusive project.
Yeah, no, totally. And in the video that I referred to actually addresses that point. So, for those who are interested, it would be interesting to go and look video. But, you know, the virtual is great. It gave us an opportunity to commemorate and to have these events, but the virtual does not replace commemoration. It's the collective coming together is so important to people. Quite frequently in the place where the event occurred, it's not always the case, but the place, you know, plays a really important role. So the virtual doesn't replace it, most certainly. But again, during COVID, it gave us opportunities. And we saw, as I gave examples there of, you know, the commemoration, the need for commemorations being so strong that, you know, we are even commemorating, you know, many of the commemorative events kind of included that idea of, you know, thanking frontline workers, etc. But the virtual, and I think, Christine, the point you made there, the digital drives the need to see something in person. I think it actually will make us want to come together more and to actually engage more with commemorative events rather than ever replace them. So it certainly can't replace them. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And I think one of the important things actually about your project in general is the emphasis on public space. And, you know, there have been discussions about what the implications are for public space through COVID. It's a larger problem, and the kind of trend of a reduction of public space and points where we meet people of different sensibilities, politically and otherwise, of different social class and so forth, can meet in public and shared spaces. I mean, there's a very important political dimension to this, quite apart from the intellectual and research dimension that I think your project is pointing to. Is that something that you're trying to feature, Bernadette, in the project, those kind of questions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are very concerned about, you know, the pressures that public space are under, and maybe the decline of the urban sphere. And we see this perhaps more in some of our other project cities, like maybe London, where we're doing a lot of work on parks. And so we're seeing parks being privatized. And in Glasgow, for example, where there's a lot of pressure on public space being used for private uses and, you know, being closed off then for public access in all kinds of ways. But I think, as Theresa said, you know, COVID has just shown us how important public space is. And our experience of living through the last few months has varied hugely depending on how much access we have to public space. There's no question about that. So it has served to reveal the inequalities, and has, I mean, we can see the public debate around public space in the city. I mean, you know, the cycling lobby, pedestrianisation lobby. I mean, this is hugely connected to what we're talking about. So I suppose one of the things we were looking for is public space for cultural purposes. I think is a big discussion that needs to be had.
Yeah,
it's okay. I might just add very quickly to that. What might actually be gained from going online is one thing I have noticed from running public events in the National Library, particularly around giving online tours or talks, is that the reach that we now have to engage people from all around the world has really increased hugely since we've gone online with our public events. So while it is a completely different experience, and it is one which I wouldn't like to have to continue with solely, it is actually something really great because people from all over the world have been able to tune in to our public talks and our public tours. So in one way it has increased access, but there has been losses on the other side as well.
Can I just throw in one more point? It also increases the longevity of the whatever is being produced, because instead of the event happening and being over, it's now people have had to produce it in different ways. They've had to make a video or record a lecture or produce a book, so that's really good. So it's lasting longer.
Yeah, and I think there's implications going forward in terms of seeing more hybrid approaches to the events, because we're beginning to see benefits. Yeah.
I think that does seem to be very likely, and I think that will hopefully be very much a positive. One of our attendees has said, Paula Dover says, is one of the advantages of doing virtual restoration is that heritage bodies can't dictate what you do. So it's an interesting perspective to bring to it. Yes, there are positives and, you know, challenges inevitably, but yeah, that's something for us to meditate on. We've run a little bit over time, and I want to thank everybody for your generosity and above all to our attendees for sticking with us. Just a few final comments. This is really an exhilarating panel, and as a board member of the Irish Research Council, I feel really thrilled and delighted to see such good work that has sprung from the funding that the IRC has provided. And obviously we thank the Dublin History Festival for partnering with us on this event. Thanks again to Felicity Maxwell for being the inspiration behind it. There's so many takeaways here. We began with questions of embodied knowledge. I think that's implicit in lots of different ways in all of the projects. In fact, because there's so much practical work to be done, even if it's digital humanities work, that's highly practical. It doesn't involve quite this, maybe the sort of hand skills perhaps that the stonemasons needed, but there's certainly equivalents. We're beginning with the notion of, you don't know what it's gone till it's, you have till it's gone. I thought another song title was maybe Burnt Survivors. That maybe could be another possibility. So we have lots of interesting inspiration to take away with us today. Thank you all very much for participating and for bringing together this in a public space. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks. Take care. Thanks.